All black, everything, everything black. Culture over everything, y'all. We taking it back, black.
Many of the students who go on to these amazing careers, they got their start at these public black colleges that prepared them.
Welcome and good evening to this latest edition of Small Talk at FHI.
I mean, this work is going to be really necessary this next administration as they try to roll back public health, have a war on women, a war on people of color. Yeah, we're gonna need you to sound the alarm to let us know what's going on.
That's the goal. That is the goal.
Oh, wow! Do you spell Sinclair S-I-N, or how do you spell it?
It's S-Y-N.
Okay, S-Y-N.
We're very much happy to have Professor Crystal Sanders join us to talk about her new book, A Forgotten Migration.
I want to take your class.
You're
incredible professor.
Well, my students, half the time they're asleep, but anyway.
There's no way.
First, to give you a little history of what this is, Left of Black is a video podcast that was founded in the fall of 2010. We're currently in our 15th season, dedicated to providing a platform for scholars of Black studies to talk about their research and their work to lay audiences, but also scholarly audiences. And 3 years ago, because we wanted to have more engagement with our local community here in Durham, we began a series called Small Talk at FHI. This is the Franklin Humanities Institute, named, of course, after the great John Hope Franklin, who retired as faculty here at Duke. And we thought as a way to honor him and to honor also Gil Scott-Heron.
I was wondering about our yesterdays and digging through the rubble. And to say the least, somebody went to a hell of a lot of trouble to make sure that when we looked things up, we wouldn't fare too well, and we would come up with totally unreliable pictures of ourselves.
Who some of you might know, his very first album was titled Small Talk on 125th Street. So this is kind of a homage to Gil Scott-Heron and John Hope Franklin. For those of you who lived at all in New York City 30 years ago, Left of Black in and of itself is a homage to the great Gil Noble, who for 40 years hosted a public affairs program in New York City called Like It Is.
Welcome to Like It Is.
And I'm thinking about Gil Noble now because the Schomburg Center in Harlem just, in fact, acquired the totality of the Like It Is archive. For their archives. So welcome. Talk a little bit about what it's like to come back to Duke and also to come back to the Triangle.
Sure. First of all, thank you for having me.
Yes.
I have oftentimes told Professor Neal that to be on Left of Black is akin to having your wedding in Jet magazine. It's a sign that you have arrived. And so I am very honored to have the opportunity to discuss my work on Left of Black.
And this is your second time.
Yes,
right?
That's
This is
right.
your second time.
But I graduated from Duke. I'm celebrating my 20th class reunion in the spring, so that gives you an idea of when I graduated. I had a wonderful experience at Duke. My very first semester here, I met a historian by the name of Ray Gabbins, and from the very first week of class, he told me that I could be a historian. He mentored me for all 4 years that I was here. He supported my trajectory through graduate school. Unfortunately, Dr. Gabbins passed away in 2016. A week before he got sick, I was at the Stanford Warren Library. I had not told Dr. Gabbins that I was in town. I'm literally having a conversation with Andre Van, sitting in a setting just like this, and Dr. Gabbins walked in the room. Little did I know that that would be my last conversation with him, But I can tell you that conversation was about this book. I told him, it was a book talk at Stanford Warren about my first book, and Dr. Gavins was always someone telling me to think ahead, and so he said, what's going to be the next project? And I said, well, Dr. Gavins, I'm thinking about writing about this arrangement of black students having to go north for graduate study. And he says, oh, that's a great topic. I'm familiar with it. You need to write this book. And so I'm very happy that I did get it to fruition. It's nice to come back to Duke. I've never met someone, at least in my generation, that is not always excited to come back home to Duke. I had a wonderful experience. I was a Robertson Scholar here. I see one of the former Robertson Scholar staff members in the back.
And as a sidebar, one of the current Robertson Scholars has just been named as a Rhodes Scholar.
Yes,
right?
I saw that.
African-American woman.
Yes, very excited to see where her, her career path continues to go. Someone sent me the press announcement yesterday about her. So very excited about that. And so I'm just happy to be here. Duke was a place that nurtured my love of history. I'm from the Triangle. I'm from Clayton, North Carolina. My parents are here. I've got some family members here. And so it's just nice to come home, right? And when you think about it, my father used to always say, it's an honor to be invited to come back home, right? Everyone isn't invited. So I don't take that lightly, and I'm thankful for the opportunity.
And so let me show my manners, because I know half the people here know you. But for the people who don't know who Professor Crystal Sanders is, she is an award-winning historian. This is the official narrative. Historian of the United States in the 20th century. Her research and interests include African American history, black women's history, civil rights history, and the history of black education. She received her BA, cum laude, in history and public policy from Duke University, and a PhD in history from Northwestern University. Professor Sanders is the author of A Chance for Change, Head Start in the Mississippi's Black Freedom Struggle, published by UNC Press, our friends down the road, in 2016. And of course, she's joining us today to talk about A Forgotten Migration, Black Southerners, Segregation Scholarships, and the debt owed to public HBCUs. The first thing I thought about reading your new book was how much it was in conversation with your previous book, right? That this feels like a trajectory around a history of black education that you've chosen. Talk a little bit how you got on that path as a scholar.
Sure. I'm a native of Johnston County. My grandmother and my father and my cousin, who's sitting in the room, all attended an institution known as the Johnston County Training School. It was the largest and the oldest high school for African Americans in Johnston County. And when I was 13, my grandmother gave me 2 bricks, 2 red clay bricks, and she gave them to me for my 13th birthday. And I was quite puzzled and upset that this was my gift, because normally my grandmother gave me a check for $25 every birthday. I wanted my $25, but I got 2 bricks. And I remember saying to my dad, what's up with grandma? Why should she give me these bricks? And he said something like, well, did you ask her where they came from? And I did, and my grandmother told me that those bricks came from the Johnston County Training School. She had graduated as salutatorian of the class of 1945 at the training school. And immediately after Johnston County Schools moved to mandatory desegregation, the Johnston County School Board had the training school building torn down. And my grandmother was a nurse at the local hospital, and she took off work on the day that the school was being torn down, and she walked to the campus and got these bricks. And so she had held on to them, and then she decided that she wanted to give them to me. Wow. So remember, though, I wanted my $25. So I had these bricks. I really wasn't thinking too much about these bricks. But going through school, whether we're talking about my U.S. history course or my AP U.S. history course, my senior year of high school, or even some subsequent history courses that I was taking at Duke. Oftentimes when the conversation got to black education prior to desegregation, it was a negative narrative, right? Everything was bad, everything was used. There was nothing good, nothing to talk about, nothing remarkable. And I remember thinking, that's not the narrative I got from my grandmother. That's not the narrative I got from my father. In fact, my grandmother took off work to go get bricks from this building because her education meant so much to her, right? And I began to say, you know, this is I wanted to kind of figure out this large gap between what I was being taught about Black education, right, in school, and what my family had taught me about the Johnson County Training School. So here at Duke, that was my undergraduate honors thesis, and it was called More Than Bricks. And I talked about kind of the experiences of Black high schools prior to desegregation, cultivating a kind of a culture of aspiration, right? That these were Black teachers who really instilled in Black students that they could go as far as they wanted to go, right? And this was an institution that was the center of Black life in my county, right? This was an institution that everyone knew each other. The teachers knew the students knew the teachers, they all lived in the same community, and it was central to their upbringing. And whether these students went on to the military, to college, or to the workforce, they left with a sense of self, right? And so it was that love of the Johnson County Training School that made me say, this is something that I'm interested in, the history of Black education. So when I went to grad school, I initially thought I was gonna keep writing about Black high schools. And while kind of digging around the archive, I found something on Howard University students protesting in the 1930s. In the 1930s, there was one Black member of Congress, Oscar DePriest, congressman from Chicago, and the House of Representatives had a dining hall for members of Congress, and he was the only Black member of Congress, and he wasn't allowed to use the dining hall.
Right.
His aides, who were also Black, were not allowed to use the dining hall, and a group of Howard University students decided in 1934 that they were gonna set up a protest at this House of Representatives dining hall. The group of students was led by Kenneth Clark, who we would know 20 years later from the Brown case. And so this is what I wrote my my graduate master's thesis on. I actually did it on two schools, Howard and Fisk. When I was looking at activism at Fisk, I interviewed John Hope Franklin because he had been student body president at Fisk right after a lynching had happened right off campus. So I'm thinking, this is my master's thesis, it's gonna become my dissertation topic. But you know, sometimes, this is also telling my age, I was using microfilm, so I'm using the microfilm reader, and you know how you press the fast forward button? Yeah. And if you press it too hard, you're gonna go way ahead. So I was supposed to be in 1934, and I ended up in 1965. And what I came across in the congressional record was this speech by Stennis, Senator Stennis of Mississippi, kind of railing against Head Start. And he's saying Head Start is a front for communism, it's full of beatniks. And I remember sitting in the Northwestern Library in front of that microfilm reader, and I was like, Head Start, what can be political about Head Start? And so I said, I remember going back and telling my graduate advisor, who's now on faculty here, Nancy McLean, and she said, Crystal, you need to finish this master's thesis. I don't want to hear about, what's going on. But so I finished the master's thesis, but then I came back to this topic. That became the dissertation topic. But what I was struck by was that in this Head Start program, started in 1965 by working class Black women, they saw Head Start as the opportunity to give Black children quality educational opportunities, right? So this is 1965, right? 11 years after Brown, but we know in the South there had been no meaningful desegregation. And even though Black students in Mississippi were in all Black schools, their teachers were reporting to all white school boards, so they still weren't able to kind of have the type of education that they really wanted. And they saw Head Start as their way to give Black children the type of education that they had envisioned, right? An education that cultivated a culture of aspiration, similar to the Johnson County Training School. So that's the first project. And then moving to the second project, the common thread is this long demand among Black Americans, particularly Black Southerners, for quality education, right? So I could see that in Head Start. I see that in the people I write about in this book who really want the opportunity to reach their highest potential. And for many of these people, that was going on to graduate and professional school.
You mentioned Head Start, and it resonates for me because, the research you do in your first book lays the foundation. Head Start goes national, right, by the end of the 1960s. I'm a Head Start kid, right? And I always lived with that kind of the wherewithal of working class parents, neither of which who had a college education at the time, who didn't quite know what to do with their son, but knew they needed to put him in an environment that would cultivate a kind of sensibility of learning and reading and those kinds of things. Those are the stories that you tell in both of your books about these folks. When you talk about a forgotten migration, a lot of folks don't understand this history of the way that Southern states, obviously because of Plessy versus Ferguson, were charged with created separate but equal, which inherently was never equal, right, across the board. And that also included graduate education. And as you write in the book, they were neither going to allow black students to integrate public institutions in the South for graduate education, nor were they going to build separate graduate schools, right? So they chose another option. Talk about this other option.
Yes, and I'll say that I came to this because the church that my family attended, First Missionary Baptist Church in Smithfield, North Carolina, there were many retired public school teachers in that church. And I was always amazed whenever their bios would be read that they had these graduate degrees from NYU and Teachers College. And these were degrees they got in the late 1940s, early 1950s. And I was thinking, why were all these black women going to the Northeast, right? During the era of Jim Crow. I was thinking, why didn't they come to Durham?
Private schools in the Northeast and public schools in the Midwest.
And so, you know, in trying to ponder what made them go so far away during a time where traveling while black was truly difficult and dangerous. I mean, not that it's not dangerous today, but it was, you know, especially dangerous and humiliating in 1944 or 1954, I began to realize they had no other choice. They had to go north because there were not options for them to pursue graduate study in the South. And so this arrangement, however, of compelling black students to go north actually started with the black man. In 1920, a black man is elected to the Missouri legislature, a black man by the name of Walthall Moore, and he ran on the promise of telling black Missourians he would improve education for African Americans in the state of Missouri. And Missouri at that time had one public black college, Lincoln University. But Lincoln was in no way the black counterpart of the University of Missouri. And so after Walthall Moore is seated in the Missouri House in 1921, he introduces legislation to upgrade Lincoln. He asked for $1 million to improve the physical plant, to expand the curricular offerings, and to begin offering graduate programs. And he said there's one section of the bill that says, in the interim, while Lincoln is being upgraded, the state of Missouri will pay for black students to go to other states to get the same opportunities that white students have at the University of Missouri. But Walthall Moore saw this as temporary, right? He said it's probably going to take 7 to 10 years before we can really upgrade Lincoln to make it the black counterpart of Mizzou. And so during that short temporary period, right, black students can go out of state. However, segregationists jumped on this and thought, well, this is a way that we don't have to invest in public black colleges. So in Missouri, what was seen as a temporary measure by a black legislator becomes a permanent solution to African American demands for quality educational opportunities beyond the bachelor's degree. And what starts in Missouri would continue or spread to border and southern states all across the country, and to the point whereby in 1948, Mississippi becomes the 16th state to do this. So between 1921 and 1948, 16 states are going to begin compelling black students to go out of state. And many of them will continue these programs until the early 1970s or late 1960s. So Georgia doesn't end its segregation scholarship program until 1971.
Why would these southern states do this? Particularly the idea of sending folks away, right, to become educated. Were they afraid or have concerns that these folks would come back, or were they hoping that they wouldn't come back?
Oh, you know it's the latter. So we know, you know, today, yesterday, and perhaps forevermore, in many cases, African Americans who were able to secure any form of education are seen as dangerous. They're seen as threats. They're seen as uppity, right? They're seen as a problem to the racial status quo. So for many of these southern state governments, the hope was that when they send these black people, right, to Michigan and Wisconsin and New
Chicago,
York,
right.
they're going to stay there because they're the problems, right? They're not going to be content with the status quo. They're not going to be content with the way things are done in North Carolina. But the joke was on them because the overwhelming majority of these segregation scholarship recipients come back, and they come back ready to use their credentials and their training and their know-how to dismantle white supremacy in every single way that they can possibly do, right? So whether that's in law, whether that's in medicine, whether that's in education, they are using their training to try to improve life for African Americans.
What was graduate education like for black folks in the early to mid 20th century?
To answer that question, let me say, you know, if you've taken history classes, you learn about Charles Hamilton Houston. So I knew about Charles Hamilton Houston before I started this project. Charles Hamilton Houston is kind of known as the architect of the legal strategy to desegregate public schools in the United States. But the more I learned about him through this project, I realized that he is one of the most brilliant thinkers and legal strategists that has ever walked the earth. And I say this because when the NAACP first approached Charles Hamilton Houston about joining its legal affairs bureau, Charles Hamilton Houston said, well, and he was a lawyer. His dad had been a lawyer. Charles Hamilton Houston had gone to Amherst undergrad and Harvard Law, where he had been the first black member of the Harvard Law Review. But he says to the NAACP, you know, you all are spending all of your time and all of your money trying to get a federal anti-lynching law. And he says that is a waste of resources. He says you're never going to get a federal anti-lynching law through the United States Senate. And he says, so if you're inviting me to join the NAACP to work on this, then I'm not interested. He says, but if you're willing to pursue something that's actually winnable, that's actually possible, then sign me up. And of course, you know, the NAACP board of directors are like, well, tell us more. What are you thinking about? And he essentially says, you know, there's a thing called precedent in our American legal system. And he says there's that 1896, separate but equal. And he says with graduate education, we not only don't have separate but equal, it's separate and non-existent. He said, so it's going to be very easy to go into court and say the University of North Carolina has bachelor's, master's, and PhD programs for white North Carolinians, but North Carolina College has none of that. So there's not separate but equal, it's separate and non-existent. And he says we can go into court and win. And he actually says, and then when we go into court and they say that they're willing to create black programs or to create graduate programs at black colleges, we'll then go right back into court and prove that these programs are not equal, right? So he's saying this is a whole strategy. And then he says, and it's smart to start at the grad level for two reasons, right? Because at the grad level, it's separate and non-existent. But also, he said, white people will be more comfortable with adults going to school together first, right? He says, we can't start with elementary and secondary education. He says, this is going to be a long battle, but we're going to get there and we're going to use precedent. We're going to get these court cases. And so when we think about the road to Brown, the first victory is going to be Gaines, right? And that is he's going to steadily go into court and build all of these court cases, working their way into declaring segregation in public schools unconstitutional. So I say that to say, you know, that's when we think about graduate education or professional school education in the early 20th century, it is really separate and non-existent. And when we think about a place like Howard or Meharry, they are carrying a very heavy burden. At one time, Howard has the only law school for African Americans in the country, right? We know that Meharry and Howard had the only two medical schools. And when you look in the records, Howard and Meharry were getting 3,000 applications for between the two schools, 100 slots in medical school. What does that say about African American access to professional health care, right? This is a real problem. What does that say about African American access to strong representation in courts when there wasn't but one institution training black attorneys? So I mean, it was critical that they open up these opportunities beyond the bachelor's degree to African Americans.
Any Eagles in the house? You want to tell them the first PhD program at a black institution?
That's right. You know, most people think that the first PhD program at a black institution was at Howard, but in fact, the first PhD program at a black institution was at North Carolina College, It was created in 1952 with the first degree being conferred in 55. And it was in education. So you could do a PhD in supervision and administration or in elementary education. So it would be here in North Carolina that played, North Carolina plays a significant role in efforts to expand educational opportunity for African Americans, whether we're talking about that first lawsuit, right? That unsuccessful lawsuit trying to desegregate the pharmacy program, or the ways in which President Shepherd is really trying to navigate a North Carolina General Assembly to create more opportunities for Black students, or the ways in which law students at North Carolina College are going to be going into court to ensure that North Carolina College's law school is funded at a level adequate or equal to that at UNC.
You tell the story of Alabama, right? One of these segregation places in which students, yes, we will pay for you, but you're going to be reimbursed. Talk about the challenges, and this is really the case for all of these schools, because inevitably the money that was given by these states to these folks is never going to meet the reality of what life is lived like on the ground. Housing, food, clothing, travel, safe travel. But Alabama was like, you come up with the money first, and we will reimburse you. How many Black folks did that really under the understanding that they might not ever get reimbursed?
So let me say, when I start this project and I would tell people about it, they would actually say, well, that doesn't sound like such a bad arrangement. People got to go to NYU, they got to go to Michigan, they got to go to Harvard. It wasn't that bad. And I say, well, wait a minute, right? These segregation scholarships were completely inadequate to cover the costs that recipients had to bear in order to get the same opportunities that white students were able to get at home. So the case of Alabama in particular, as Professor Neal said, they required you, wherever you went to school, to pay the full amount of tuition. And then you send them a receipt that you have paid your tuition, and they would give you the difference between the cost of tuition at the University of Alabama and the cost of the institution where you studied. So I write about several Black natives of Alabama who struggled to pay their tuition in order to stay in school. I opened the book with the case of Fred Gray. Many of you may know Fred Gray, famous civil rights attorney. Right. He is thrust into the national spotlight in 1955 when he's Rosa Parks' attorney, 1 year out of law school. And then he becomes the attorney for the Montgomery bus boycott. He would go on to represent the survivors of the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. He would be responsible for desegregating public schools in Alabama. But he decides, well, he knew from a young age that he wanted to be an attorney. Of course, the University of Alabama was off limits. And let me say that the University of Alabama and all of these other schools were not all white institutions. They were just non-Black institutions, right? So University of Alabama has Asian students in the late 19th century. The University of North Carolina has Asian and Native American students beginning in the late 19th century. So it's not that these are all white institutions. They are non-Black institutions. And so being Black, Fred Gray cannot go to the University of Alabama Law School. He decides to go to Case Western Law School, which is in Ohio. And every semester, he is struggling to come up with the funds to pay his tuition so that he can actually stay in school. I didn't put this in the book, but I learned through him that on one occasion he thought he was going to drop out because of lack of funds. Omega Psi Phi, his fraternity, comes through with a check and says, you're not going anywhere. We're going to make sure that you finish this degree program. There's another case I talk about, the case of Todd, who was a native of Alabama who ends up going to Southern University's law school. And he's believing that, you know what, he's going to be reimbursed. However, he didn't know the fine print always said, if the cost of tuition at whatever school you attend is less than the cost of tuition at the school you're in, you're not going to get anything. So he actually had Southern to allow him to go on credit. And he was to pay Southern when he got his money from Alabama. And he's waiting and waiting for that check. And when it comes, it's a check for $3. And that was only part of his train fare. And so he's wondering where his money is. And they say, well, didn't you know? you're at an institution that costs less than our institution, so we actually didn't have to give you anything, but we decided to give you some money to go towards your train fare. But there are countless stories like this, right? Because just as it was, or just as it is today, it costs more typically to live in a northern city than it does in a southern city. So going to New York City or going to Ann Arbor, Michigan, or going to Madison, Wisconsin meant that these students had much higher rents than they would have had if they'd been able to stay in their home states. They're having to pay to go back and forth, traveling by train or by plane or even by personal car. I tell the story of Charles Ray, who I came to find out was the best friend of John Hope Franklin. Charles Ray was on faculty at North Carolina College, but Charles Ray was a native of North Carolina, and he goes to the University of Southern California for his PhD in English. He graduates in the 50s, and North Carolina gave every segregation scholarship recipient one round-trip ticket per year. That was the rule. So they would pay for you to go there and pay for you to come back. But if you wanted to come home for any breaks or anything in
Christmas,
between,
holidays,
that's
right.
on you. After Charles Ray became ABD, he did like many of us. He came back home. He was actually teaching
To write his dissertation.
he was actually teaching at North Carolina College. And so he used his round-trip transportation money from North Carolina to actually go back to USC to defend his dissertation. So he defends that dissertation, he comes back home, he thinks all is well, until he learns that USC has a policy that you must attend graduation in person. They did not award you your degree if you didn't show up for graduation in person, which means he's got to get back to California. But he's already used his transportation money from North Carolina to go defend his dissertation. So he begins writing to the state superintendent of education, explaining his situation, saying, look, I need some money. I need help getting back out west. They're not going to allow me to graduate. And North Carolina says, so sorry, you know the policy. We can't give you any more money. You need to find a way to get back out there if you want to have your degree conferred. And so indeed, he's having to fundraise. He's having to borrow from friends and family. And he does come up with the money and is able to go back and get his degree. But it's these types of inconveniences, right? Obstacles that are caused by segregation that many of these segregation scholarship recipients oftentimes recounted. So this was not a walk in the park, right? They're going to perhaps some of the best institutions in the country, but they are in no way, living it up. They're in no way having positive experiences. Even the case of John Hope Franklin. He was a native of Oklahoma. Oklahoma paid for him or gave him a segregation scholarship to go to Harvard. If you've read his autobiography, he talked about all of the racism he experienced at Harvard, right? All of the professors telling darky jokes in the classroom, suggesting that the work he wants to do is not scholarly. These were the experiences of segregation scholarship recipients once they got to these northern institutions, right, that are supposedly these bastions of liberalism. But they were completely hostile to many of the black Southerners who were matriculating there.
The second part of your book in the title is the debt owed to black public institutions. And I want to use a sports analogy, in part because one of my students is in the back who plays for Duke football. But football at these schools is typically a revenue generating sport, which means the money that football players make in television contracts and everything else subsidizes the largely white sports teams like lacrosse and soccer and tennis that don't generate revenue. And so people got upset when athletes started demanding that they get NIL and an ability to make money, as they are not only supporting the interests of the university, right, by playing a sport, right, but also subsidizing these other teams. I mention that because what we forget about thinking about these white public institutions in the South is that black people pay taxes. So black folks are subsidizing white institutions that they can't go to.
Exactly.
What made this worse, as you talk about in the book, for these segregation situations, that money didn't come out of the general taxes that black folks were paying to these states. It came out of the budgets for HBCUs. So HBCUs are being doubly penalized within this context. They're being underfunded, but then they're also funding to send students away from this state to be educated. Talk a little bit about that dynamic.
Exactly. So to come back to this case of Missouri, right, thinking that segregation scholarships started in Missouri, remember I told you that Walthall Moore had introduced a bill asking for $1 million to upgrade Lincoln. Lincoln never gets that money. They get about $40,000. That's a huge gap between $1 million and $40,000. But Missouri is going to spend lots of money to send the black residents out of state rather than invest in the state of Missouri.
Right.
Many of these states, Missouri included, paid for their segregation scholarships by taking the money out of the annual operating budgets of the black college. So let's take a state that's been in the news right now, and that's Tennessee, right? And there's been a lot of discussion about the state of finances at Tennessee State University. You may remember that in September of 2023, the Biden administration sent letters to the 16 governors of the very states that I write about, saying that those states had underfunded their black land grants. And in Tennessee, the black land grant is Tennessee State University. And you might recall that the Biden administration said between 1987 and 2020, Tennessee had underfunded Tennessee State by $2.1 billion, $2.1 billion. And when I read that letter, because I read every single one of those 16 letters, I said, what made them start in 1987? With Tennessee, you can go into the archive and go back to 1936 and look how annually money is being taken out of Tennessee State's budget to fund its segregation scholarship program. If we were to calculate the amount of money that Tennessee State University lost between 1936, when their segregation scholarship program started, and the mid-1960s when it ended, and we put that in 2024 dollars, Tennessee State is really owed about $7 billion. That's a huge sum. And so today, when we talk about the fact that Tennessee State needs new buildings, that Tennessee State has not been able to maintain its infrastructure, that its physical plant is lagging behind in terms of having the newest amenities, it's very clear to explain how we got here. And it's not poor management by Dr. Glenda Glover or any other leader at Tennessee State. This is a lack of money, or money that has been stolen or denied Tennessee State University by its state government. This is not my opinion. You can go into the archive. If you look at the legislation that started the segregation scholarship program in Tennessee, it says we will pay for these scholarships out of the annual operating budget of Tennessee A&I University. It was Tennessee Agricultural and Industrial. That's the same narrative in 9 other states that had segregation scholarship programs. In Arkansas, every dollar that sent a black resident out of state came out of Pine Bluff's budget. Pine Bluff, the black land grant. In Florida, every dollar that paid for a black Floridian to go out of state came out of FAMU's budget. And don't get me wrong, segregation scholarships were big money. This was big business. In 1 year, I believe the year is 1951, Florida spent, what was it, $70,000 on segregation scholarships. And that's not in today's dollars. That's in 1951 dollars. Imagine if we put that money in 2024 dollars. There's a reason that we see these institutions lagging behind their white counterparts today. And the media might want you to think it's all bad management or that alumni aren't giving. But really, there's a documented history of Southern states underfunding these institutions. In the book, I call it robbing Peter to pay Paul, because these institutions were already underfunded, and then you're taking more money out of them, right, to preserve segregation. And so that's one reason that there's a debt owed, because we know that this is money that's being taken out of the budgets to fund segregation scholarships. But I also say there's a debt owed because if you know anything about higher ed, typically graduate and professional school programs can be revenue generating, particularly the professional school programs.
Right.
A law school,
and master's programs.
Right, yes,
right.
A law school, a dental school, a med school, a business school, a master's degree program. Those bring in money, right? Those bring money to the institution. And we have to think about the fact that these Southern states did not have to send black students out of state. They could have invested in these institutions and created graduate and professional school programs at them, and those would have been revenue generating programs that would have been a boom to these institutions even today, right? UNC Chapel Hill is making money off that pharmacy school. They're making money off that law school. They're making money off that medical school. And these were the types of opportunities that were denied to black institutions.
We're going to come back to the HBCU conversation, particularly in a contemporary context. But you opened the book again talking about Fred Gray, and you introduced this term of intellectual warfare. The way that folks go and get these segregation opportunities, segregation scholarships, and bring black knowledge to their homes to deploy in ways to dismantle and unravel white supremacy. Talk a little about some of those examples.
I mean, the intellectual warfare starts when they get to these institutions. You know, most of them talk about the fact that this was the first time that they had gone to a white institution. You know, most of them had their undergraduate education at black colleges.
Right.
And when they would show up at these white schools and say where they went, most of their classmates were like, we have never heard of this, right? Louis Sullivan, when he gets up at Boston University Medical School and says, I'm from Morehouse College, he told me that everyone said, did you say Morehead State? And he said, no, I'm from Morehouse.
It's that Harvard thing.
Right, yes. And so he talked about feeling a little unnerved because he was from Atlanta. In Atlanta, everybody knew Morehouse. Now he's like, I'm in Boston, and no one seems to put any respect on my institution's name. But he talked about after that first exam, where he scored the highest score, right, in the class, he said now all of a sudden everybody wanted to know about Morehouse and what type of training, right, he had received in undergrad that allowed him to succeed at Boston University. So that was the first way that they're deploying intellectual warfare, because they're going into these schools and they're showing that their HBCU educations have prepared them to do well at a Harvard or a Michigan. I love the story of Carrie Meek, the congresswoman from Florida. She goes to Michigan in the 1940s with a segregation scholarship, and she talks about the fact her classmates, you know, they were struggling academically, and she's like, that was the worst of my, that was the easiest or the least of my problems. You know, she said, I was trying to find housing in Ann Arbor, but academically, FAMU had more than prepared me. You know, she's like, I could do that work in my sleep, right? So number one, they are showing the training that they have received at their undergraduate institutions. All of them are going to graduate near the top of their class. Fred Gray does, Louis Sullivan does, Carrie Meek does, but then they come home, right? And they are using their training to make life better for other African Americans. And so Fred Gray says he knew before he even left for Ohio that his plan was to come back and sue the state of Alabama every chance he could get. Like he literally said that. That's what I plan to do, and that's what he has done. And I have to say that's what he has done because he's still practicing law today. Like literally, he's in court almost every single day.
At like 92 years old.
A Durham connection would be Dr. Edmonds, Helen G. Edmonds, right? She's a native of Lawrenceville, Virginia. She gets a segregation scholarship from Virginia to go to Ohio State. She becomes the first black woman to earn a PhD in history at Ohio State. And what was her dissertation that became her first book, right? The book on fusion politics in North Carolina, where she set the record straight on the Wilmington 1898 massacre. And when her book comes out in 1951, the historical profession completely dismisses it. And they say, she made this stuff up. This is not what happened in Wilmington 1898. She was completely discounted and discredited as a historian, but it's her account that was the accurate account, right? It's her account that's been vindicated now in 2024. And so we see her using kind of the historian's craft of using archives to kind of interpret the past. She is deploying intellectual warfare. She was trying to really explain, right, how an entire community was uprooted, right? The only successful coup in American history. And she was trying to say this was not a riot of black people against white people. This was a complete massacre of Wilmington's black population, right? And that she's making this argument in 1951. It won't be till about 1998 that people are willing to accept that argument. But we now know in 2024 that
because there's a PBS special called American Coup, and you will see Dr. Sanders in it.
but it's important for all of us to remember how fragile democracy can be if we're not all vigilant. And Dr. Edmonds was trying to make that case in 1951. I think we've all known now that it's critical, right? It's critical that we all remain vigilant about ensuring that we can all participate in the electoral process. But I mean, lots of people are deploying intellectual warfare.
So let's talk about this moment, right? And I'm gonna shout out a Duke student here now, Jabari Kwesi, graduated in computer science in 2024. 23. He is now a second-year PhD student at Duke.
Congratulations.
in computer science. And as he reminds everybody, he's Jabari from the Bronx. But I mentioned Jabari in this context because black students now, if they are talented and gifted enough, can literally go to any institution that they want. There are the best and the brightest of black young folks who make a choice not to go to PWIs. But there is all of this disinformation about what occurs at HBCUs. And I'm often navigating this, and I'm sure you have this experience too, with your black students at Emory, like my black students at Duke, who have bought into the framing of what happens and what doesn't happen at HBCUs. More people in this country found out about Howard University in the last 4 months because of the vice president. More white Americans in this country found out what the Divine Nine is, which we are both members of, in the last 5 months. There's no question that however this election was going to play out, win or lose, that there was going to be some sort of reckoning and retribution directed toward these institutions. As a historian, how do you think this will play out in the coming years?
Oh, good question. And it's funny, one of my students asked me that recently because, you know, at the beginning of the semester where we kind of do introductions and they asked me what I did, and I said, oh, I study black education. I said, I just wrote this book on, you know. So the student remembered that and actually said, so what do you think is going to happen now? And I tried to maintain, you know, a positive message in the classroom at all times. And I said, well, no matter who is in the White House, right? This book is suggesting that these are Southern state houses that have a debt owed to these black colleges. So I do believe that we may see at the federal level you know, large or a significant decrease in funding to HBCUs. I'm scared that that is definitely on the horizon. I mean, I think all HBCU administrators are probably, you know, trying to ensure that they can continue to have a budget that allows for payroll and that allows students to continue to have opportunities that they need to pursue all of their plans. But what I was trying to tell the student is that no matter who's in the White House, whether it was going to be Donald Trump or Kamala Harris, what I was trying to show was that there's a debt owed by Southern state governments, right? The idea that the claim that Maryland institutions or North Carolina institutions or Tennessee institutions need to make is against their states because their states
that's where the reparations need to come from.
Their states had a constitutional obligation to ensure that they were funding them at the same level that they're funding other public institutions in those states. And these states have not met that obligation. They're not meeting it in 2024, but they definitely weren't meeting it during this era of legal segregation. And so, yes, we know that there is great reason to be alarmed and to be scared and to be fearful. But what I'm really hoping is that black alumni of HBCUs decide that they're going to go into court and ask a court to compel these Southern state governments to fulfill their obligations and to redress the harm that they have caused through this long-term underfunding and neglect of these institutions.
Because the reality is black alumni giving and philanthropy is never going to match the needs. And it'd be better actually to organize legally, to force the states to address those issues.
I mean, and it's not asking for anything special. It's asking for what's owed. And this is not an opinion, right? This is what I think, this is what I want. But you can use the archive to make the case. It's all there. You can go into any state archive, including in North Carolina, and find lists of names of students and how much. You can go into the state superintendent of education's annual report and see how much money was spent on segregation scholarships for any fiscal year that you choose. And that's true whether we're looking at Oklahoma, Alabama, North Carolina, South Carolina, Florida. All of the evidence is there. And so that's what I'm hopeful that perhaps there will be a more concerted effort to begin to demand that Southern states repair the harm.
What was the story that you came across while researching this book that really just gave you a moment to pause because it was so shocking or surprising to you?
I mean, honestly, they all were. But
Yeah.
let me tell you a story that's not in the book that
Okay.
really stuck with me, and that's the story of Aaron Henry. If you know anything about Mississippi Civil Rights Movement, Aaron Henry was the longtime president of the Mississippi NAACP, and he gets a segregation scholarship to go to Xavier University and study pharmacy. And
Xavier in Cincinnati.
no, Xavier
In New Orleans, right.
Louisiana,
The
yes.
black
yes.
Xavier.
So black colleges that had graduate and professional school programs did receive segregation scholarship recipients. So Howard, Meharry, there were a few black institutions that are receiving black Southerners. And so Aaron Henry goes to Xavier for his pharmacy degree. And like USC that I mentioned with Dr. Charles Ray, Xavier had a requirement that you must attend graduation, that you did not get your diploma if you did not participate in commencement. But the problem was that commencement at Xavier was the exact same day as the pharmacy board exam in Mississippi. So Aaron Henry is kind of like, well, what am I going to do? Because Mississippi only offers the license exam once a year. And so if I'm not there to take this exam, I'm going to have to wait a year before I can begin
Practice, right.
he wanted to start a pharmacy before he could open a pharmacy in Clarksdale, Mississippi. And he's like, but if I don't go to Xavier, I'm not going to be a pharmacist anyway because I don't have my degree. And so first he kind of talks to the Xavier administration, any way you can make an exception, and they say, no, you need to be here. So that would, when I heard this story, I'd start thinking, this is even another way that segregation is inconveniencing black people, right? Because he's having to make a choice between taking an exam or going to graduation. And so he literally starts talking to his pastor, to his friends in and around Clarksdale, and they say, let's raise money to get you a plane ticket. And so what you're gonna do, as soon as you cross the stage at Xavier, you're gonna get on a plane and fly to Memphis. And we will pick you up in Memphis and rush you to Oxford, where the exam was being taken. He talked about the fact that literally, when he goes across the stage, someone is waiting to take him to the airport. He gets a flight. He literally, when he walks in the door to take that exam in Oxford, they were locking the door. So I mean, he's running to get to his seat, right? So he has to be in two different places in two different states at the same time. He pulls it off. And he talks about the fact that despite being hurried and stressed, having to run in at the last second, he scores the third highest score on the pharmacy exam, right? But it was the fact that he is so inconvenienced about having to figure out how he can make this work logistically. And that's kind of indicative of all of the ways that segregation scholarship recipients are having to overcome additional obstacles put in their path because of segregation. And Aaron Henry goes on to open his pharmacy program, his pharmacy right in downtown Clarksdale, and it becomes kind of a headquarters for the movement in Mississippi because he has this back room that they can have meetings in, and it's a black-owned business. So white people in Mississippi didn't know what was going on in that back room, right? But it was essential that he get this pharmacy degree so that he can then become a pharmacist, open up his own pharmacy in Mississippi, and then use that business to kind of further the movement. And so it's a beautiful story, but it was just a reminder of these types of obstacles, right? Of having to figure out, how can I be in two places at one time? How can I ensure that I'm able to truly practice the career that I want to practice?
Right. And these institutions are not going to accommodate black bodies at all in this moment.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned the last segregation scholarships are in the 1970s. What does graduate education look like for black folks beyond that particular era? I mean, because I've long heard numbers that even today, the majority of black PhDs, if not getting a PhD from an HBCU, have at least one of their degrees from a HBCU, right? So it still continues to inform the pool of who's out there.
Oh, most definitely. I mean, since we're in Durham, I have to say that North Carolina Central sends more black students on to get PhDs in history than any other institution in the United States. And I think back to Helen G. Edmonds, right? She's going to be one of the key figures in making North Carolina Central's graduate program in history what it is today. But with respect to kind of those first decades of Southern flagships admitting black students into graduate and professional school programs, it was a very, we could say, tough row to hoe in the sense that these students are treated poorly. These students are not given the same access to student resources and student opportunities as their white peers. When the first black students enter UNC's law school, at first they weren't even allowed to go to sporting events. Then they're told they have to sit in a particular section at the sporting events, and that was away from all of the other students, right? And so they're having to constantly complain and threaten a lawsuit to kind of have any semblance of a similar experience to that of their white peers.
Let alone questions about where they can live in Chapel Hill.
Yes, yes, yes. Well, remember when the law students get a dorm room, suddenly the whole floor is empty, and it's just them, right? So that was a sign that that the university was going to practice its own form of internal segregation because these law students have a whole floor of a dorm that is normally full to capacity, but all of a sudden it's no longer, the demand isn't there, right? So many of these students talked about being treated poorly, but also feeling the pressure of having to succeed, right? That was something else that I really thought about with this project, because oftentimes NAACP lawyers are kind of in the wings saying, now we got you in, you best finish. and so when Donald Murray enters Maryland's law school, Charles Hamilton Houston tells him, look, there's going to be no women, there's going to be no parties. You can, for 3 years, you've got to be all about the books. And he actually tells them, if at any time you're feeling that you don't understand the material, we got a whole team of lawyers here at the NAACP who will tutor you. Because he said, we can't afford for you to flunk out.
Right, there's an investment.
And so for whether we're talking law, medicine, some of these PhD programs, those first few cohorts, there is a burden for them to not only finish their programs, but to ensure that they are finishing at the top of the class, right? Because the NAACP says there's a whole race out here waiting on you to show what we can do. And so that was, I thought about it in regards to my own graduate experience, and that's a level of pressure, right, that I did not have. When we think about, graduate study today, you're exactly right. We tend to find that individuals who go on to get PhDs, many of them continue to have a connection to black colleges in some way. Either they went there undergrad, they went there and got their master's degree before they matriculated into a PhD program elsewhere. So it's, again, a sign of the importance of these institutions in giving students the opportunity and giving them the support to say, this is something you can do, and it's something that you should pursue, right? And that's not always the message that's sent from predominantly white institutions. But the other thing that I talk about in the book, however, is that we still see Southern states hesitant to put graduate and professional school programs at black colleges. So we can't think that this is something that only existed, right, during this era of legal segregation. And I use North Carolina because I'm a North Carolinian. And the two examples that I used, in 1974, North Carolina's General Assembly said they wanted to start a vet school. And there were two options for this vet school, North Carolina A&T or North Carolina State. The federal government said to the UNC Board of Governors, you all say that you're trying to move to a unitary UNC system. It would make sense to put the vet school at North Carolina A&T, right? This is going to be a professional school program, tuition revenue generating program, the stature that comes with a veterinary school. A&T is the right place to put the program. But the General Assembly said, well, we're not so sure. We're going to commission some outside studies. They commission these outside studies, and the people essentially say the same thing. that the federal government had said. This program needs to be at North Carolina A&T. Despite all of that, if you're familiar with North Carolina's vet school today, you'll know that that vet school is at North Carolina State University. So it showed, right, that even after desegregation, our legislature did not have the will to put a revenue-generating professional school at one of its public black colleges. And even in the 21st century, this is still a problem. If you know, UNC has a great pharmacy school. I've got cousins that went through that school. But there is such a demand for pharmacy in the state of North Carolina that the General Assembly said we need a second public pharmacy school in North Carolina. And this is when the General Assembly was democratically led. The Democrats had the majority. And it was Mark Bass-Knight who said, we're going to put a second pharmacy school at Elizabeth City State University, right? HBCU in the northeastern part of the state. This was going to be a boom to ECSU. This was going to bring in money. This was going to bring attention. This was going to allow the school to grow in new ways. While the legislation was passed to create that pharmacy school at Elizabeth City, they did not fund it. And then the legislature switched parties, and it became a Republican majority legislature. And that pharmacy school was one of the first things on the chopping block. And this was in the 2000s, right? So this shows that we still have a hesitancy on the part of the North Carolina General Assembly to really put graduate and professional school programs at public black colleges.
The irony of all of this is that if you are a white North Carolinian, and you don't get into UNC law, or you don't get into Duke law,
Yes.
you go on North Carolina Central's campuses and their law school, and a third of those students are white students.
Right, yes. I mean, we see our public HBCUs as being, they've always been open, right? They've always been open in a way that their white counterparts have not been. And we see that even in the 21st century, these institutions giving all students an opportunity.
For you, this is a history that many folks before tonight really didn't know. And we're in this weird moment where so many of our elder storytellers are leaving us. So there's a history that's being lost. If I'm being quite honest, we're witnessing a generation of young folks who don't have the same hunger for this information that we may have had. And then, of course, there are deliberate attempts at misinformation and disinformation that treat this information as toxic. I mean, we think about all the conversations in Florida about our kids. Right. We don't want to hurt the little white kids and how they feel about themselves and their self-esteem by telling these stories. As a historian, right, someone who's committed to doing this work, what does your future path look like in terms of the kind of research that you would like to do?
Oh man, what a good question. I always say that I want to use my scholarship to tell the truth freely, like Ida B. Wells, right, would tell the truth freely. And with respect to black education, I think it's important for us to, when I say us, I'm talking all Americans, to understand the way in which education has always been political, right? And I think oftentimes we don't know this long history of the way that it has been weaponized, the way that it has been used to create caste, right? A caste system in a sense. And I think for African Americans in particular, it's important to understand how central education has always been to the freedom struggle.
Right.
And that's something that I feel like I have to ensure that I continue to do. Like even with my students now, and especially a lot of my black students, and they don't necessarily understand how central education has been to black liberation in the United States.
Absolutely.
And I think about the fact that we do have a president-elect who has talked about doing away with the Department of Education. And so for almost any of my classes, no matter what I'm teaching, my students will tell you this, I somehow weave in Du Bois's Black Reconstruction, because they're going to get that chapter on education, okay? And what I love about that chapter is that he says in the South, education was the creation of freedmen, right? He's essentially saying that when we look at public education in the South, it was black people, black men who went into Southern state legislatures during Reconstruction and codified universal public education as a right. And that's very important in 2024 that we ensure everybody understands this, right? We have to understand that in Southern states, prior to Reconstruction, only the wealthy had access to education. Poor whites did not have access to education. It was a vision of black men.
Not a white,
exactly.
not a right.
But it was a privilege of black men to say that education should be a universal right of everyone. And I'm very scared that if we do see a dismantling of the Department of Education, we're going to move so far from this idea of public education as a universal right and as a public good, right? Because if we don't have a strong Department of Education that's ensuring that every child, no matter their socioeconomic background, no matter if they have a learning disability or not, has the right to an education, then we are setting ourselves up to go back to a time where there wasn't universal public education. And this is critical, right? I mean, if we don't have universal public education, then we are going to have a population of people who are not prepared to have a job in this workforce, right? To understand how our electoral process works, or to have any understanding of the importance of public goods, right? The idea that there should be some common things among everyone, no matter what side of the aisle you're on, no matter how old you are, no matter what race, what gender. I just feel that it's key that we really understand the history of education in the United States and the ways in which African Americans in particular have worked to make education accessible to all. And that's an argument that Du Bois is really trying to set out, as just like Edmonds is trying to set the record straight on Wilmington, he was trying to set the record straight on Reconstruction, right? Because there was this narrative that it was so bad and it was so corrupt. And I mean, he says, well, look, education, public education in the South comes about during Reconstruction. Right. And if we really think about it, that's one of the things that the Redeemers didn't take away. They actually didn't kill public education, right? They tried to underfund black education, but even they realized that public education was something that was essential to ensuring that we could have a strong nation, but especially a strong South. And so that's kind of what I'm a little nervous about really trying to ensure that everyone understands why education is a public good, why it's something that we should all champion. And that's something that I hope I will continue to do in my scholarship.
Right. And it's the subtle ways, right? Because they're not just going to say, let's get rid of public education. You know, the voucher movement is really about usurping, resources from public education to be able to pay for private education that ostensibly families could pay for already themselves.
Exactly. And I make the argument in the conclusion that when we date vouchers, we shouldn't date them to massive resistance. Everybody says vouchers started in the wake of the Brown decision. I mean, this forcing black students to go outside of the state with Southern state governments outsourcing their responsibility, right? They're outsourcing their responsibility to educate black citizens. This, I think, is the progenitor of vouchers, right? We can see this effort of knowing how to use public funds for private education to preserve segregation. And then we see it completely, we see it used in Virginia, right, beginning in 1955, massive resistance. But Virginia had been doing segregation scholarships since the 30s. So they knew all too well how they could use public funds to preserve segregation in education.
We're going to open up a Q&A to the audience for those who might have questions for Professor Sanders.
Thank you for your presentation tonight. And I know we were all just excited because I spent about 2.5 hours watching PBS on Wilmington 10. I have friends that live in that area. I'm a history buff myself. Talk to us a little bit about what do you see the next 5 or 6 years as it relates to the many differences of opinion, because when it all boils down, if we don't have an educated society, we miss everything.
number one, I feel like no one can concede the fight. Like we can't, as tired as we may be, as mad as we may be, we can't throw in the towel, right? So what that means, number one, is fighting back, speaking up, challenging misinformation, going to meetings, right? Making sure that your voice is heard, making sure that your voice is seen, not leaving anything on the table in the sense that, you know what, the policies that are enacted might not be policies we support, but we're not just going to remain silent, saying that we don't support them, right? We're going to show up, we're going to say why these things are wrong, we're going to write about why these things are wrong, we're going to sound the alarm so that later on there can't be anyone to say, well, we didn't know, right? We didn't know that this was possible. We didn't know that this was a consequence or this could be a consequence. So that's number one. But then number two, I'm really hopeful that this will be a moment where we see, I would call it like a 21st century version of freedom schools. You know, I know that freedom schools still exist with the CDF, but thinking about what happened in Mississippi, right, in the 1960s, and if you know anything about education in Mississippi in the 1960s, you know, Black history was not taught in those schools, right? And it would be during these freedom schools that Black students are being introduced to Black history, Black students are being introduced to the Constitution, Black students are learning what their rights are as American citizens. And I think we need that again. I think students need to be, and students of all ages. When I say students, I'm not necessarily thinking 5 through 18. I'm thinking students of life.
Grown folks.
Right.
Grown folks.
Need to be reminded of what the Constitution says, right? I tell every other class period, we're talking about the 14th Amendment, right, in my class. And I want my students to understand what it is that it says, so that when they make their demands, they are grounding it in the Constitution. I think it was Martin Luther King who gives a speech one time, and the title of the speech was, be true to what you said on paper.
Right.
And that was a speech where King was saying, we're not asking for the world.
Right.
And I can't go to China and ask for what I'm asking for, but I can ask the United States
for it,
because this is what the United States has said on paper. And that's going to be really key in this next 4 years, to remind our legislators, to remind our neighbors, to remind our friends of what this country has said on paper. But the question is, where are they going to get this information? So that's where these freedom schools come about, right? And I think of institutions like the Black Church, like D9 organizations. They're going to have to figure out ways to create settings where these conversations can be had, right? We think about the movement, but they were strategists, right? They didn't just one day say, this is what we're going to do, right? But they had meetings, they had a plan, and they knew what the law said. And I think we have to kind of get back at that. We've got to get back to that, being able to be on defense and offense, right? But you got to be prepared. You know, I know Dr. Bullock sitting here in the front row, she played basketball. You know, you scout out a team. You know what their arguments are, or you know what who their defense players are, who's their shooters, and you're going to put your best blockers on their shooters. We've got to be strategic, right? We've got to know what is being said and know how to respond, and respond in a timely way, in a coherent way, and respond in a way that's grounded in the law, right? Grounded in the Constitution, because if not, it's all about what we want, our opinions, how we feel, and that's not what this is about. This is about being true to what was said on paper. And so that's, I mean, I don't know if that answers your question, but I really think it's going to be very important for us to be organized, for us to be prepared, for us to ground our demands and our complaints and our resistance in the law, right? Because that's really, at the end of the day, all we got. And so we're going to have to make it work in a way that, you know, past generations made it work.
You know, the point that you make about freedom schools, right? Because there's an argument to be made that we should have never let go of that structure, right? That we always needed to have a space to counter, right? The miseducation that was taking place in these very formal settings. My students, I teach a class, Michael Jackson and Prince. All right, and we watched, it's an interesting experience, right? But we watched Prince's Most Beautiful Girl video. And if you remember the video, Marva Collins is featured prominently in the video. And you know, Marva Collins started in West Chicago, independent schools in 1975 to counter what was happening in the Chicago public school system. And Prince gifted her $500,000 in 1985,
Wow.
right, to expand these schools. And I particularly wanted to show that to my students to remind them that undergirding all of this quote unquote celebrity, right, the $25 million over the course of his life that Michael Jackson gave to the UNCF.
Yes.
That folks rarely know or
Right.
even talk about, that
Right.
even when they're at this highest echelon of celebrity, they had an investment, right? I'm wondering, what would a personal local Highlanders look like? Right.
Yeah.
In places like Durham or Atlanta, where you could have 5 of them, right? Where kids are coming to Saturday academies,
Yes.
right? And to your
Yes.
point, not just K through 12, right? But adult learners
Yes.
within that space.
Yes. I mean, and we need it more than ever because we see
Absolutely.
this attack on Black history, right? And so we're going to have to figure out venues to teach history that's inclusive, that's accurate, that is not writing out of the narrative, right?
Right.
The experiences of non-white individuals.
Absolutely. Yes, sir. Speaking of North Carolina Central.
Brett Chambers, Duke alum, but North Carolina Central, totally connected. My mother's a Golden Eagle before she passed away. And I always tell people I'm a Blue Devil because my mother was a Golden Eagle.
Yes.
There were so many things you brought up just in the last answer, especially when you start talking about freedom schools, because one of the places that had a freedom school up until recently, out of the hip hop initiative,
North Carolina
was North
Central.
Carolina Central University, and it was gotten rid of by North Carolina Central University. So now, with you saying that, and I'll take, as soon as you publish this, I'll get the clip. But my question for you, because that can be that's one of the strategies, but how do we connect this academic discussion and this legal revelation to economics? Because that's what drives this country at the end of the day. And you being a former public policy major from here, you know that that's what we always looked at, is the intersection of policy, business, and law.
I mean, well, with respect to this project, this is why I'm making the claim for redress, in the sense that there's money that's owed to public Black colleges from Southern state governments. I don't know where the Southern state governments are going to come up with the money, right? But they need to find it, because this is not a wish list, right? This is just asking for what is owed. That's a conversation to be had among, the budget committee members of Southern state legislatures. That's the way I feel, in the sense of being able to figure out how Black colleges are going to receive the funds owed by Southern states. I mean, and there's a variety of, perhaps it could be, there was one time in North Carolina when Mickey Mashaw was still in the General Assembly, he had introduced something called catch-up funds. And this was a way that for several years, the HBCUs, the public HBCUs, were to receive a higher rate of funding from the state as a way of acknowledging all of those decades of underfunding. I don't believe the catch-up funds are still in place today. They're not. So, I mean, that's, figuring out some type of similar policy, but done on a much larger scale, is the beginning of what needs to happen in terms of addressing this long-term debt that's owed to these institutions. And state by state, they may do it differently, but the point is to acknowledge that this money is owed, and then tell Southern states, you figure out how you're going to pay it. It's not just enough to say we're owed the money, but then there needs to be legislation, some type of program that's going to result in beginning to pay the debt.
So my follow-up to this is there a way, if it's okay, sir, for us to find some private sector, large leverage, that could help us make that point that is beneficial to the bottom line? Because you made that point when you were talking, but I think I've heard somebody from Goldman Sachs and Damon, just saw him in September, and he was saying diversity is good, and we need it. So how do we start getting some allies on that corporate side to help them make the case to the state legislatures that this is good for all of us?
The business, yeah.
Well, number one, I'll say even if there were no ally on the private side, this is a matter of looking at what is documented, right, a documented debt, right? But however, HBCU alumni in particular that are now working in these corporations might be some of the ones to say, you know, to their employers, we would like in some way perhaps you to partner with our institution to create some type of I don't know, pipeline that's going to create internships, or a pipeline that's going to, you know, create a pathway for students to, upon graduation, have the opportunity to work at these institutions. And that could be an example of these private sector corporations acknowledging the importance of these institutions, right? And so perhaps that would nudge Southern states to say, we need to ensure that these institutions have the resources they need to continue sending out generations of students that are well prepared to then enter this private sector. But I'm arguing that even if there's no private sector alliance, Southern states have a responsibility to do right by all of their institutions, right? So that would be great if we see some private partnerships that are going to create pipelines and scholarships and everything else. But whether that ever materializes or not, the General Assembly owes its 5 public colleges some money, right? And so my argument is, I don't think anyone should wait on the private sector to come forward and say, these institutions matter, so Southern states, please get in line. I'm just hopeful that alumni, right, and even allies of these institutions, right, just other citizens, other North Carolinians that are concerned about higher education are going to make the case that, you know what, Southern state governments, you need to do right by these schools. We want to see them succeeded in the same way that flagship institutions are. And this is especially important in this moment where we see, you know, exponential increase in applications to our public black colleges. In the wake of this affirmative action decision, North Carolina A&T and Tennessee State had record applications. And there were tons and tons of qualified North Carolinians turned away from North Carolina A&T. Not because they weren't qualified to be there, but because North Carolina A&T did not have the dorm space for these students. And so this is why if North Carolina A&T received proper funding from the state, they could build more dorms, they could hire more faculty, they could put more resources in their library, and then they could admit more students. And so we see that the demand is there, and every single year, I mean, Tennessee State turned away several thousand, solely because they didn't have the dorms. Why don't they have the dorms? Because they haven't had the money to build new dorms in years. And yet we know they're owed all of this money. So anyone can connect those dots and see that really we just need Southern states to do what they are supposed to do what they said on paper. And that's all I'm asking for, and I think that's all a lot of alumni want, for Southern state governments to adequately fund public black colleges.
Dr. Sanders, thank you for being here. My name is Clark Easley. I'm a freshman Robertson Scholar here at Duke. And so at Duke, black men are outnumbered by black women 2-to-1, and I know this is something that we see at HBCUs and in graduate programs across the country. How do you think this gender divide sets up contemporary threats to liberation efforts?
Oh my gosh, what a question. From a first-year student, Musa.
And I just got to add this to your question. The Assistant Vice Provost for Student Affairs at Howard was on NPR about 3 weeks ago, talking about the lack of black men going to college. Men are 26% of the population at Howard. So it's 3-to-1. But only 19% of that population are black men. So roughly less than a fifth of the population of students at Howard, undergraduate students at Howard University are black men. Right? So you almost feel fortunate at a place like Duke in that context. But
well, I think about this in terms of, you said in terms of the liberation, present day liberation struggles. And I think this comes back to education and education being political. Because to understand why we don't see black men going to college at the same rates as black women or men of other races, we gotta look back at this K-12 education, right? And we have to figure out where it is along this K-12, trajectory that we are losing black men.
boys, right.
Or young black men or
boys.
even black boys. And so to begin to address what's happening at higher ed, we come back to having to figure out what's happening in elementary and secondary education. And there's lots of things that we know are problematic. When we think about the fact that we haven't seen the same levels of black teachers, right, in our K-12 schools since mandatory desegregation.
Yes,
we lost a whole field of educators when we know all of the scholarship says, right, that black students do well when they've had a black teacher. I think it's between like 2nd and 4th grade. That can make a huge trajectory on if black students, but black male students in particular, graduate from high school. And so to really begin to address what we're seeing at the college level, we've got to come back to this K-12 level. And again, I'll come to North Carolina, because when I was a high school student in North Carolina had a teaching fellows program that included several of the black colleges, right? They were sites for teaching fellows program. And then remember, the teaching fellows program went away. And if you don't know the Teaching Fellows program, including a Teaching Fellows alum right here on the front row, you could go to an institution on a Teaching Fellows scholarship, a public institution in North Carolina, and after your tuition grant that you received would be waived or forgiven, right, after you worked in a North Carolina public school for 4 years. I believe that's what it was. And then remember, the Teaching Fellows program was completely on the chopping block, and then it came back. And when it came back, it not only allowed programs at public institutions, it allowed them at private ones as well. And when they placed the programs at institutions in North Carolina, there was not a single one at one of the 5 public HBCUs. And to add insult to injury, they placed one of the Teaching Fellows programs at Meredith College. I have nothing against Meredith, but Meredith is a private institution, right? It's a private institution that has a very low non-white student population. And so I sat there when I read that the Teaching Fellows program was coming back, and I looked at the list of institutions. I said, now, ain't this something? How are we really going to ensure, right, that we have a pipeline of black educators going into public schools in North Carolina, and we couldn't find one public institution to put, one public black one, to put one of the Teaching Fellows programs? And so you have to understand that what this means is that students all across North Carolina, in all 100 counties, perhaps are going K-12 without ever having a black educator. Yep. And not just are they not having a black educator, but for many black students in particular, and black males definitely in particular, are finding the classroom to be quite hostile, right? Where they are being penalized for the same behavioral issues that other students are not being penalized for. Or they are not encouraged to take honors and advanced placement courses, right? They're being steered into a trajectory that's preparing them for the workforce rather than going to college. Not suggesting there's anything wrong with that, but the problem is there are some students who have the potential to go on to college, but no one encouraged them to do so. They didn't have a black teacher, they didn't have a black counselor, and they've never seen anyone go to college, perhaps in their community, and so they don't know that that's an option. And so where you've got all of these roadblocks, K-12, then you're not going to see them in your colleges, whether you're talking about black colleges or white colleges, because somewhere along the way, they found education to be hostile to them, right? Somewhere along the way, they were told that college really wasn't for them. Somewhere along the way, they were kicked out unfairly, so they didn't even finish high school. And so if we think about this in terms of a black freedom struggle, right? When we know that education has been central, right, to an African American freedom struggle since before emancipation, right? We know that it's been critical. Then if black students and black male students in particular are being, cast to the wayside somewhere along their educational trajectory, then they're never going to get to the place where you're sitting right now, right? And so this gets back to, how do we ensure that black students are able to reach their highest potential, right? How do we ensure that they are given the resources and the opportunities that they need to finish high school and then to be able to go to Howard, Duke, A&T, wherever they want to go? But for all too often, it's the same narrative, right? And that door has been closed for them, not by them, but for them, by other people along their elementary and secondary trajectories.
And let's be clear, Professor Sanders, right? We saw the ramifications of this play out over the last 6 months, where we have young adult black men, even older adult black men, who rather than, and you know, they got targeted. Let's be clear about that, in many cases unfairly. But let's be real, we're talking about 2 generations of black men rather than read information and get truth, more willing to go to a podcast and listen to Charlemagne the God as their source of information, right? Yeah. And part of that is about a disconnect.
Right. Yes.
Right. Part of that is about a disconnect, right? You know, we don't encourage, right? We think of reading as gendered. So little girls read books, right? And boys don't, right? We let boys go out and run and play and all these kinds of things. And it manifests itself in really interesting kind of ways, right? Because, you know, we're talking about the absence of black men at these colleges, right? But these black men still exist, right? They just never made it into that part of the system.
Hello, thank you for sharing your time with us, and welcome back. Dr. Nikki Washington is a computer science professor here at Duke, and a good friend of Dr. Mark Anthony Neal. And the other day we were talking, and she was telling me that before she came to Duke to teach computer science, she was, and my memory is a bit fuzzy, she said she was a professor, or she might have been the director at Howard University in the CS department. And she told me that when she got there, she was told that she's the first black woman in the Howard computer science department. And I was so surprised. That was not even 20 years ago. So makes me wonder, if you're a black student, you want to learn STEM, you go to a HBCU, even Howard, a really high profile HBCU, and then you see your faculty, they're not black. So I want to hear your thought on that.
And to give a little background, Dr. Nikki Washington is my colleague in the computer science department. There are 2 black women in the computer science department at Duke now, which is fairly extraordinary. And she came to Duke after being at Howard for some time. And when she was at Howard, she was the only black woman on the faculty in the computer science department. Many of the faculty weren't just white, but also South Asian, Asian, Indian, et cetera, et cetera. And Dr. Washington, because she really is a unique figure, she sits in my Michael Jackson class every week, right? So that's where we were having this back and forth discussion about, you know, how she came to Duke and that experience.
Wow. First, let me say I'm not surprised. I don't know when she joined Howard's faculty. I'm not surprised that she would be a pioneer even in the late 19th, early 20th, or late 20th, early 21st century. I'm not surprised that she would be a pioneer for 2 reasons. Number one, I could say HBCUs have done a better job of having diverse faculties than predominantly white institutions. So HBCUs have had a history of giving opportunities to scholars of, you know, various backgrounds. I think about the fact that in the, the World War II period, it would be HBCUs that would give refuge to German Jewish scholars from Europe, right? Tons of them are going to enter Talladega, North Carolina College. So these are institutions that have a long history of giving opportunities to scholars of all races and backgrounds. And then 2, we know that STEM fields in particular have been hostile to women and then have been extremely hostile to black women. In the same way that I talked about, you know, in this K-12 trajectory, there being put obstacles in the pathway of black males. When we think about black women in STEM, many obstacles being put in their path, not just in their undergraduate education, but in their graduate education. So that, I don't know the numbers in her field in particular, but we still know that there are very small numbers of, terminal degree holders among black women in many of these STEM fields. And because there are so few of them, I'm not surprised that she would have been the first at Howard. I don't know what year she got there, but that is still an indication of why we need strong graduate and professional school programs at public black colleges to ensure, number one, that there are institutions that are going to make training a diverse you said she was in computer science, training diverse students in computer science and other disciplines, and then also creating opportunities for them to be hired, in the sense that we know there are still obstacles in ensuring that places like Duke and other predominantly white institutions have faculties that kind of reflect the world that we live in. And what's interesting when I say that is, when I was writing this book, many of these segregation scholarship recipients who got terminal degrees at places like Harvard and Michigan and Wisconsin, these institutions would not hire them, right? So we know there's this long history of these institutions training African American scholars, but not believing that these scholars have the the qualifications and the credentials and the intellect to actually be on faculty, right? So we even think about someone like John Hope Franklin. It was years before white institutions began recruiting John Hope Franklin, right? Helen G. Edmonds, Ohio State was not going to hire her, right? She comes to North Carolina College, has a phenomenal career, but it wasn't as if many of these institutions were open to having black scholars on faculty.
Right, and when Harvard wanted to hire John Hope Franklin, it was to launch their Black Studies department. And John Hope was like, nope. So I'm not the one.
Thank you. Good evening, Dr. Sanders. It's been great to sit here and hear you speak and share your story. I'm Rhonda Taylor Bullock for everyone else. And I lead a nonprofit here in Durham called We Are, which stands for Working to Extend Anti-Racist Education. And so previously we were talking about the need for black educators in the classrooms, the roles that that plays. And as someone who looks at whiteness, something that we rarely hear is that white educators are overrepresented in education, and that white women in particular are overrepresented in classroom teachers. And I'm wondering, just from your understanding and lens, what would that reframing do to, as we think about the need for black educators in the classroom, the reframing that white people and white women specifically are overrepresented as classroom educators?
And first, thank you, Dr. Bullock, for that comment. One of the things, remember I told you I came to this project because I was amazed by the number of black women public school teachers. They were retired by the time I came to know them, but they had these graduate degrees from some of the best institutions in the country. And that was true of black public school teachers across the South, right? During the era of legal segregation, they were more highly credentialed than their white counterparts. And this matters. It's important to tell this story because as Southern states moved to unitary systems, it would be the black teachers who lost their jobs. And so we know that school districts were firing the most credentialed folks, right, in order to allow white teachers, white women in particular, to keep teaching jobs. And so, number one, that was something that blew my mind as I read this book, because I was like, I always knew that there was this mass loss of black teachers, black educators with school desegregation. But these teachers were, you line them up, look at their CVs, right? They are heads and tails above their white counterparts, yet they still lost their jobs. But when I think of the overrepresentation of white teachers and white women teachers in particular in public schools today, what I think needs to be said in the conversation is that it's not just black students who benefit from having black teachers. This is crucial to white students as well, right? There is a lot to be learned from sitting in a classroom and learning from someone who's different from you, right? That the choices that a teacher makes in terms of what goes on the wall in those classrooms. If they're going to ensure in a kindergarten classroom that there are white dolls and black dolls, right? I look at that when I'm looking at a preschool for my child. I want to ensure that the teacher, even if she isn't black, had an understanding to say this classroom has to represent the world, right? And it's key for all students to have the opportunity to learn from someone who's different than them, because that sets them up to live in a global, diverse world, right? So when I think of the overrepresentation of white educators in the classroom, for me, it's the case needs to be made that this is doing a disservice to every student, right? Every student needs the opportunity to learn from someone who's different from them, who comes from a different background, a different culture, who's going to ensure that the books they assign, I even look at my colleagues, I'm going to say, let me see your syllabus. I want to see, are you assigning text by women? Are you assigning text by non-white scholars, right? That matters, right? And people may not think about it on the surface, but that says a lot about how you understand learning. And if you want to ensure that your students are exposed to different people, different ideas, different voices, every single choice from, what books you're gonna read, what pictures go on the wall of the classroom, what, holidays you choose to prioritize in your classroom, all that matters. And everyone brings their own experience to the classroom to ensure that every student, especially white students, have the opportunity to be prepared to live in our global world, right? They really need the opportunity to learn from teachers who are different from them. And that's what I think is missed. So in the same way that, yes, we don't talk enough about kind of the overrepresentation of white women, we don't talk about the ways in which white students benefit from a diverse classroom. And that needs to be the diversity in the student body and among the faculty. And it's a win-win, but unfortunately, we don't have those conversations. And typically when we talk about the need for black teachers, it's always only because it'll help black students. But really, it's helping the entire school, right? It's helping the students, it's helping the other teachers, it's helping the administrators, because we really want our students to be prepared for the world that they're gonna live in. And so if they have the opportunity to learn from a black teacher, then perhaps when they are 25, they're not gonna be afraid, right, to see a black person walking down the street, or to live in a neighborhood beside a black person, or to have preconceived notions about black people when they are interviewing other people for jobs, right? To set everyone up for success, to ensure that we can all begin to have a better understanding of one another, we need to ensure that all of our students have access to a teaching force that's diverse.
Thank you, Dr. Sanders, for your time, for your perspectives today. I really appreciate your words. One thing that kind of stands out to me, that was a theme of a couple of different conversations that we've had tonight, is that when a lot of people talk about representation and visibility for people like ourselves in these programs, a lot of the time that doesn't extend to leadership and preparation for leadership roles, A lot of people that occupy these positions, they aren't necessarily prepared to come back and be leaders, you know what I'm saying? So for me, my progression, my survival in these places that I've been in, I haven't necessarily had a lot of the access to leadership positions I've seen my peers have, Everything I have, I've had to fight for a lot of times against the grain. What would it look like what's it going to take to put into place opportunities for students like myself to be able to naturally come into these leadership positions and not have to do more than is necessary to be in these positions to be able to lead people coming after them?
If I'm honest, I really don't have a good answer to that question. But what I will say is that now that you know that these are leadership opportunities that are possible, that exist, what it's gonna take is you telling the students who are coming after you, right? So I'll give you an example. When I was a freshman here at Duke, I learned about a program called Dukes and Duchesses, and it's kind of the student ambassador program. And so my freshman year, and they have students from all 4 grades, or 4 classes, but when I learned about the program, there was only one black student who was a Duke or Duchess. I would call her name, I know her name now, but I won't say it just because, but anyway, she's still a good friend of mine, Rita Rollins, so I just gave the name. And I remember my roommate was a white woman, and she said to me, one of my aunts told me about this program that you can apply for your freshman year. I think I'm gonna apply for it. And I was like, what's this program again? Dukes and Duchesses, so I heard about it from her. But what I decided was I was gonna apply for the program, and I was gonna ask some of my friends to also apply, but more importantly, every other year, I made sure to tell other black students that Dukes and Duchesses is an opportunity that you should consider, right? So I can't tell you that the fight is gonna ever go away, but what you can do is just make sure that succeeding generations or classes that are coming behind you know that the opportunity exists, right? And so what you're trying to do is to ensure that even when you're gone, right, there's gonna be people who look like you in that organization or in that leadership role, because now this is not a secret that's kept from the black student population or from any marginalized student population on campus, right? So that's like the biggest thing that I can think of, is ensuring that other people know that this opportunity exists. And it was a wonderful opportunity because it put you in conversation with administrators at Duke. So essentially you were kind of the student ambassadors. If someone famous came to campus and they wanted students, you were in the room, but you're also getting to learn the president, you're getting to learn the deans, you're getting to learn the provost, right? Because you're constantly seeing them at these events. And that was important to begin to understand how higher ed worked, right? I didn't really know anything about what's the difference between a president and a provost or what a dean did, right? But it was through being a member of this organization that I began to see how the university worked. And so that kind of, all I can say is whatever opportunity you're doing that you learned about and you're thinking, it's a shame there aren't more people who look like me doing this, you just have to ensure that as you're talking to younger students coming behind you, that you say, hey, let me just give you a heads up. This is something you should consider. This is something that will not only allow you to learn more about campus, but it will also put you in rooms with people who you should know, right? And that's key.
And honestly, Jabari, you're already doing that. You're already doing that work.
Is Mike on? All right, so once again, I want to say thank you for your time, Dr. Sanders. I have truly enjoyed this conversation.
What's your name?
My name is Christian Rory. But yeah, like I said, I truly appreciated this conversation. I want to talk about what's in the back of everybody's mind the past couple weeks, which has been the election. And seeing how that man got into the White House, and at the same time, the Senate, the House, the majority of the governors being read, what does that look like impacting HBCUs going forward in the next 4 years? What are the risks to look for? And on the other side of that, what is the hope? Like, what can HBCUs do to combat the actions pending?
Well, first I'll say, and it's funny, I said this to my friends the day after the election. They were like, oh, we don't want to hear this right now. Because I said, well, as a historian, we have been here before, right? This is not the first time that there's been an election that makes African Americans scared for their lives, right? We have to think about that 1876 election that ends Reconstruction, where federal troops are taken out the South, which meant this was going to be a reign of lawlessness and terror, right? Where African Americans did not have a friend at any level of government. We've been here before. And so the takeaway from that is, again, not conceding the fight. So that means, you know what, we're going to continue resisting, continue speaking out. We think about it, if we think about the end of Reconstruction, I talk about with my students as a turn inward, meaning we saw the rise of Black institutions, the National Association of Colored Women, 1896, the NAACP, 1909, AKA, 1908, AFIA, 1906. Why does this matter? It was a way that we began to see African Americans around the country turn inward and say, we're going to have to collectively survive, right, this period of repression. And we're at that point again, where that means we're going to have to see Black institutions, right, and not just talking about HBCUs, but talking about churches, talking about organizations, civic organizations, saying we're going to have to stay the course. We're going to have to turn inward. We're going to have to ensure that our children are learning Black history, even if they're not learning it in school. We're going to have to dig a little deeper in our pockets if indeed HBCUs take this financial hit, right? We don't have the resources to fund them at the level that the federal government could and should, but we're going to continue to do what we can do. We're going to make sure that we make our annual contributions, and we're going to hold these states accountable. This is more critical now than ever to go after the states, right? No matter who's in the White House, go after the state house, because there's a constitutional obligation, right?
Politics is local.
Exactly. So the point is, yes, it's all right to be upset, to be shocked, to be weary, but then we have to say, you know what, we've been here before, and we need to draw on those same things that were done earlier. And that's why I think institutions like the Black church are critical in this moment. We're going to have to see the Black church step up, right? Step up, open their doors for freedom schools, open their doors for tutoring programs for students, open their doors to community meetings, that we can begin to figure out how it is that we can survive this collectively. And that I think is going to have to be the strategy. Because yes, there are probably some very hard times ahead, but we have seen this before. People forget Woodrow Wilson decimated the federal government with respect to giving Black people jobs, right? We remember it was Woodrow Wilson who segregated the federal government. This was, again, a time where it looked that that African Americans did not have a friend in any level of government. But we see, once again, they began to turn inward and to say, we're going to use our institutions as kind of the foundation to survive this repression. And that's going to have to be the playbook for the next 4 years.
Thank you for joining us this evening. The program, of course, is Left to Black. You can follow us at our brand new website, lefttoblack.org. I want to give a quick shout out to Left to Black's producer, Eric Barstow. Also, our friends and partners on board Char, who provided the meal behind. Please eat all of the food. So thank you again for coming out this evening.
Thank you, everyone.
Blacks, they be hyping, I'm the light that lit your match. A black watch for all the times I watch MTV raps. Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts. And every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black, everything black. Culture over everything, y'all, we taking it back. Black.